Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and today we are speaking to Dr. Scott Prasser. He's worked over the years in federal and state governments in senior research and policy roles, and that is actually where I first met him, when he worked for the Education Minister at the time, Christopher Pyne. He holds undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications from the universities of Queensland and Griffith, and he has just written a new book on royal commissions and public inquiries in Australia, which is what we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Scott.
G'day, how are you?
I am very well and very jealous of you in sunny Brisbane and in not locked down Brisbane. I am very much looking forward to getting back up to Queensland when your dear Premier lets me. But royal commissions and public inquiries are a real feature of the Australian political landscape, and I really would love to start our discussion today, Scott, talking about what are these things, these public inquiries and royal commissions? What sort of creature of government, of architecture are they? Can you paint us a picture of the legislative underpinnings of these things that have been around, I understand, since 1902? We've been blessed with them.
That's right. Public inquiries are ad hoc temporary bodies appointed by executive government with people from outside of government to give advice to government on a whole range of things. And of public inquiries, the Rolls Royce of public inquiries are royal commissions. Royal commissions are established under statute. And one of the early acts of the new Commonwealth Parliament was the Royal Commissions Act 1902. Now, so royal commissions have real powers of investigation. They can make people attend their hearings. They can make you give evidence even if it can incriminate you. You lose your rights when you appear before a royal commission. A royal commission can seize documents. It can phone tap. So they're very powerful bodies. So there's royal commissions and there's these general public inquiries, which are just groups of people being appointed by government to give advice, which have no powers, which rely on support by the fact that they've been appointed by government. They have no constitutional standing in Australian government. They're not in the Constitution. They're appointed by executive government. They're a particular type of advisory body which all governments appoint to get advice.
Right, and even a general member of the public could be forced to appear, could they, Scott, before a royal commission? You don't have to be in a particular public role like a member of parliament, a member of the government, a public servant. It could just be the guy running the shop down the road.
That's right. So if the Royal Commission is investigating a particular topic and think that you can give evidence to it, you don't want to give evidence to it, they'll say, we'll send someone around to bring you to the Royal Commission so you do give evidence to it. They take evidence under oath, and so if you tell lies, you can be prosecuted, all sorts of things. So Royal Commissions, they really come from Star Chamber type inquiries going back to the 16th century in Britain. But governments appoint these sort of bodies because governments often don't have all the expertise, and also governments want to investigate an issue and show that it's independent and not being run by the government. That's where the rationale for them comes from.
And that's not a modern day feature of government. That, as you said, the Royal Commission Act was passed in the extremely early days of our federation by the Commonwealth Parliament in 1902. So these have been around for an extremely long period of time, but they sort of play a role of being, kicking the can down the road, to use a is a tried and true phrase. It's a way of a government maybe deflecting attention from a tricky situation and deferring a decision to a panel of experts. It might be a way of trying to just smother a really tricky issue or show that they're doing something, even though doing something about the problem might be politically incredibly difficult.
That's right. So there's two basic reasons. One, it could be a government really wants to know how to tackle an issue, or they really want a problem investigated, or they really want to get at corruption, or they really want to know why a bridge collapsed or why an accident occurred or bushfires, or they may want to get some expert advice on education or television or pensions. But you're right, there also are politically expedient reasons why governments appoint inquiries. And I'm sure you know, and your listeners know, that governments don't always know what they're doing, and they often need time to try and work out what step to take. So a Royal Commission or a public inquiry can fill up the space for a while they work out what to do, or they can kick the can down the road to maybe the inquiry will report after the election, and after the election it's a new ball game, and so on. So you'll find sometimes governments appoint inquiries just before an election or a couple of months before an election and hope that after the election, if they've won, the issue will go away, or they can say they've appointed an inquiry. So it can be activity filling up space, if you like. Someone once wrote that Royal Commissions are not so much for digging up the truth as for digging it in. And I thought that's always a great quote from an English person on that issue.
Right, so the phenomenon of Royal Commissions isn't limited to just Australia. It's across the Commonwealth and in the UK, in other Commonwealth countries, denoting the royal aspect of it, I guess.
That's right. Look, the first Royal Commission is considered to be when William the Conqueror, after he conquered England, not Scotland, England, wanted to know, well, what did he actually conquer? What did he actually own? And he set up some royal commissioners who went around and held hearings all throughout England about who owned what property, how many cows they had, how many servants they had, all those sort of things. And this was compiled into what was called the Domesday Book, if you like. And this was regarded as the first Royal Commission held in 1068. It went on, it was quite a serious thing. It's a great record of who owned what. And once he worked out who owned what, he could work out what he could take from different people to give to other people with what the game was all about.
So in 1068, you didn't have huge government departments and filled with bureaucrats. In 2021, Australia's been a federation for 120 years. We have big government departments filled with bureaucrats who could be investigating why the bridge collapsed or what went wrong in a certain sector of the economy or society. Think of the Royal Commissions we've had over the last few years into aged care, currently into disability, obviously into the banking, financial services sector, collapse of HIH, the insurance company. So, I mean, we have thousands upon thousands of government bureaucrats who could look into these issues. Why is it that governments call a Royal Commission and then have to set up obviously a temporary bureaucracy around that group of usually a judge and other lawyers conducting the inquiry? But why is it that sense of impartiality?
Yeah, we don't trust government. Essentially, we don't trust government. So, and we trust government probably less. So the whole essence of public inquiries is that they're public, that their terms of reference are public, their membership are from people from outside of government, their processes are public, their public hearings, their report is public, their evidence on which they made the report is public. They're sort of naked out there for all to see, and they're at arm's length from government. And when there's a controversial issue, whether it's about some corruption or a disaster, calamitous disaster, or there's some policy problem, it's good to get the independent and often expert advice on an issue rather than just rely on government. Now, you're quite correct. There's lots of competency inside government, but we don't trust the public service these days because the public service has become increasingly politicised around Australia. So governments resort to what I call the institution of last resort, that is a public inquiry or royal commission to investigate problems.
But it feels like less and less it's the it's the institution of the last resort. It seems like it's almost a default reaction to a tricky issue is to call a public inquiry or a royal commission. I wonder then, Scott, you've explained the benefits, I guess, of these royal commissions and public inquiries. They're independent, they're transparent and open in terms of their inquiries are public, their reporting is public, the decision making behind it is public. There is a real sense of an ability for the public and the media to scrutinise every step of the evidence gathering and decision making of a public inquiry or royal commission. But what are the drawbacks of these creatures of public inquiry, the non-public servant approach? There are significant drawbacks, aren't there?
Yes, there are, and inquiries can get things wrong, right? The civil liberties aspect is a problem. You know, if you were called before a royal commission, Georgina, and we said, there's allegations about you, now this is all in the public arena, and you may be totally innocent, that it's not till 3 years later when the report comes out that we say, by the way, Georgina was completely innocent. In the meantime, it's been on the front pages of the Melbourne Age that you did such and such and such and such. So that's one problem. The third problem is that sometimes we have to question whether royal commissions, especially if they're run by ex-judges, as they mostly are really competent to give policy advice. And there's an expectation that government should follow all their recommendations. But those recommendations are made in isolation from other policy political problems like the size of the budget or the budget deficit or other priority areas. So the media gets on a bandwagon. The government should implement every recommendation of a royal commission, and government sometimes stupidly agree to that, when in fact they may not be suitable, and governments must make the decision and must make the choice of what they implement, because they're the ones that got to work out what are other competing priorities. So sometimes royal commissions get momentum all of their own, and if the government doesn't implement all those recommendations, they get condemned for it. When in fact, government's the one who's got to take responsibility for making choices and setting priorities about these matters.
Yeah, that's right. And you often hear after a royal commission or a public inquiry, the government's going to adopt all the recommendations, and then a few years down the line, actually only some of them have been adopted because politically or for, as you say, budgetary reasons, there are a whole range of broader considerations. The recommendations may not fit, and ultimately the government is there as the elected representatives of the Australian public, and that they take advice, but they take advice from a whole range of sources: the public service, their internal government advisors in their offices, their public inquiries, royal commissions, think tanks, all that and the like. But it is advice, and ultimately the decision will begin and end with the government, and can condemn the government or deliver the government a significant legacy. Scott, in your work, you look at the history of royal commissions in Australia, and you set out, which I think is really interesting, the figures of each government, how many inquiries and royal commissions they held. I noticed the Menzies government this was the second term as Prime Minister from 49 to 66. They had 5 royal commissions, 30 other inquiries, so 35, whereas you go to the Whitlam government in just 3 years. So we've got to, think of this context. So Menzies has in his second term over 16 years and had 5 royal commissions and 30 other inquiries. Whitlam's in for 3 years and he held 13 royal commissions and 73 other inquiries, a total of 86. I mean, quite extraordinary, although Malcolm Fraser has a red-hot go and beats him. He had a longer term, obviously, in government. He beats him by 6 in total in the end. But you reflect on the fact that that non-Labor governments have tended to be more hesitant towards public inquiries and royal commissions than the Labor governments of Australian history. Why do you think that is? Is there a particular reason, or is it just happenstance?
No, it's not. I think non-Labor governments used to, maybe not now, are less willing to intervene in society, intervene in the economy. They're a little bit more careful. So Whitlam government, they were in opposition for 23 years, the Labor Party, got into power, had the big platform they wanted to implement. The platform was God, in a sense. It was their Bible. And so they launched all these inquiries. Now, some were quite useful and interesting, but what happened was government got constipated. Okay, government just couldn't cope, right? You talk to the public service couldn't cope with all the reports. Some of the inquiries took too long. We had a Royal Commission to FM radio, which I think is ridiculous, quite frankly, during that period. And so I think non-Labor government...
What was the Royal Commission looking at? FM radio being a good thing, a bad thing?
Australia, that's right. They brought a person out from British Broadcasting to chair it. And that's one of the examples of one of the Royal Commissions they had. Why was established a Royal Commission? I can't find out. It's really, really strange, but there it is. It's on the list. Non-Labor governments just tend to be more careful about, and also I think non-Labor governments historically have been more trustful of the public service because they've been in power longer. Non-Labor governments have been in power 2/3 of the time in Australian politics. You wouldn't know that if you read political science books and so on. And so they're more trustworthy. Well, Whitlam was out of power. The Labor Party was out of power for 23 years. They didn't trust the public service, and so they set up.
Which is understandable. I have some sympathy for that. The institution of the public service, the personalities would have been so used to the Menzies and then Holt and Gorton and they just would have been very, very sceptical that these public servants were ready to just fall into line behind the government of the day that happens to be the other team that they've been advising the previous governments on how to oppose their policies. So it's I have some sympathy for that level of mistrust.
Yes. So there's those reasons, I think, but also Menzies in particular had a view, and his greatest put down, if you like, was over what was called the Vernon inquiry into the economy, which was really set up by Jack McEwen, the Deputy Prime Minister in that country party. And that report recommended there be a permanent advisory committee on giving advice on the economy that would release its documents publicly. And Mr. Menzies said really clearly, hey, we are the government, we make decisions, and we've got to take into account not just economic expert advice, but a whole range of other advice across other areas of policy. So you had that sort of reluctance to appoint too many inquiries going on. John Howard only appointed 4 Royal Commissions, quite a few inquiries during his time, but he was fairly reluctant to appoint Royal Commissions. And you can only say that one of them was really a political Royal Commission, if you like. So he was quite, he resisted appointing Royal Commissions quite frequently.
Scott, you mentioned Menzies' scepticism about inquiries. There's a great quote which you have sent to me in the past, but I think it's worth reading. It's a speech taken from a speech that Menzies made after the Vernon inquiry into economic policy in Australia. And he says, no government, from whatever side of the house it may come, and indeed no parliament can abdicate its own authority and responsibility for national policy. It will welcome the assistance of experts, but its tasks will take it far beyond the limits of economic expertise. Political policy in a democratic community does not depend upon purely economic considerations. No government can hand over to bodies outside the government the choice of objectives and the means of attaining them in important fields of policy, which I thought was, it's a fantastic defence of the primacy of the government and the people who elect the government in decision making. And has there never been a more telling time of governments run, the rule of experts over governments as the COVID crisis, where we have seen government bureaucrats, the chief health officers around the country. We have seen government bureaucrats elevated to the highest levels of public status. They are, I can probably name 5 out of 6 of the chief health officers across this country without even trying. They are household names now, and they are government bureaucrats, let's be honest. Most people would have no idea who the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is, or Foreign Affairs or Defence, but they sure as hell know who all the chief health officers are in their states and others and federally.
That's correct. Menzies would never have tolerated that behaviour at all. And I think you saw the New South Wales Premier last week emulating that very sensible approach about these matters. There is obviously a place for experts, but experts are often contradict each other, as you know. There's often a range of expertise. Look, I've been involved in education, and we're still fighting out how to teach kids how to read. The evidence is overwhelming that phonics is the basics, but universities don't teach it. So there we are. So it's a real difficult issue. But Menzies, I think, had a great ability to know when to appoint inquiry. And I think the 2 important inquiries Menzies mentioned, which weren't royal commissions, were the 2 inquiries he appointed into education, which really reformed education in Australia. And I think that's where he took a personal interest in this. And when he retired in 1966, he was asked one of his achievements, and he said education was one of his achievements. And Menzies' interest in education goes back to his first radio telecast back in the 1930s and his 1945 speech, and he appointed 2 really important inquiries that reformed university and tertiary education in this country.
The legacy of those 2 inquiries, there was the Murray inquiry from 56 to 57, and then there was a subsequent inquiry between 61 and 65 on the Committee of the Future of Tertiary Education in Australia. The legacy of those inquiries is extraordinary for Australian universities, but for Australian kids, for Australian people. They opened up Commonwealth funding of universities. The numbers of students between 1958 and 63 rose by 50%, and enrolment in science by 100%, and universities increased from 1939 from 6 to 17 by 1973. This was an enormous opening up of the tertiary sector in Australia, and of course the ability of kids, more and more kids, to access a tertiary education. But the next inquiry was actually looking more at not just university education, but having the ability for kids after leaving school to undertake higher education that wasn't just a university education, and valuing that, which is still to this day a real problem, isn't it?
Yes, it is. This is the Martin Inquiry, which basically set up what the Colleges of Advanced Education system, which I strongly support, which the Dawkins and the Hawke government abolished and amalgamated with universities. And it was saying that, not everyone is suitable for a university type education. We've got to have education that is orientated towards skills in the workplace and a different sort of type of intellectual development. And that was the development of colleges of advanced education, which I've taught at. And I think it's a great shame that we've done away with those in our system. So, so we've sort of got the group of 8 top universities, and we've got all these other smaller universities, some trying to copy them, not necessarily successfully, and they shouldn't be trying to copy them. They should be trying to do something quite different. So that was a great legacy that was brought in. Menzies understood, and the Liberal Party understood, the importance of education, but it had to be relevant to the workforce as well as intellectual development of individuals.
Scott, why was it that Menzies called those inquiries into education? Why did he not look to the public service or his? I mean, he had great ideas and passion, and he was always learning throughout his career. Would it have been too difficult for him to have brought through these rather huge changes without the backing of a public inquiry and the extensive reporting that went into that?
Well, just remember the Commonwealth Department of Education didn't come into being until after Menzies sort of retired. We had a small unit inside the Prime Minister's department. So the Commonwealth didn't have responsibility for education, essentially, in the Constitution, although Menzies had for a long time advocated a greater Commonwealth role in education. He moved the first matter of public importance in 1945 on education. And so the Commonwealth was gradually getting into it, and he thought that he would bring experts, and the Murray Inquiry was an expert from England, Scotland originally, and he brought in quite a big team of people from a right cross-section to really look at education in Australia in both these inquiries. So I think the Commonwealth government at that time didn't have the expertise that was needed, that was going to lead to a transformation of tertiary education. So that's what he did in that field. He brought in people from outside, some from overseas, with well-renowned reputations, to give advice to the Australian government. He took a personal interest in their appointment. He took a personal interest in terms of reference. You can see that in the records. So this wasn't just set up in any old inquiry. Menzies became quite involved in this whole process.
Was that criticised at the time, though? He'd set up a public inquiry. It's supposed to be independent of government in terms of its scrutiny of the issues and gathering of evidence in order to make their conclusions or recommendations. Was Menzies' close attention and if not intervention ever criticised at the time?
No, I don't think it was criticised. I don't think people expected, just like people today don't know, that he would follow through. Because Menzies did not just set it up, he also made sure it was implemented. As you know, the big issue about inquiries is, are the reports implemented? And he made sure they were implemented, and they started almost immediately on a 3-year program of increased funding to universities. So, and there was resistance from the Commonwealth getting involved in what was essentially a state government matter. Menzies was never a states writer in that sense. He saw that there are certain things the Commonwealth had to do. And this is the beginning of, during the Cold War. There was a lot of concern about whether the West had expertise to take on the Soviets and so on. So there was another undercurrent going on. I also think it's important to understand that the Murray Inquiry was appointed in 1956. Menzies had just won the 1955 election, and it was really Menzies finally really being on top of the political scene, and that's when he starts to do other things. Before then, he had been fighting election in 55, election 54, election 51, election 49. He finally got control of issues, and that's when he starts to devote attention to these other matters that you see coming into place, like education. And he saw himself, Menzies was a scholarship boy from a moderate family from northern Victoria, who won scholarships, who really valued education himself. He saw how it could transform people. And if he could become Prime Minister of the country and become an outstanding lawyer because of his education, not because of his class, he thought that would be good for Australia.
Yes, it was a nation-building activity first and foremost, wasn't it? His investment in education, he saw Australia as an incredibly young country, and in order to progress economically, we needed a country that was educated so that people could create their own businesses or enterprises off the back of a high-quality education and high capabilities too. Do you think the 100% increase in enrolment in science that you saw through the sort of outcome of the Murray inquiry into education, was that driven by that sense, that Cold War environment that you saw the Soviet Union investing in science and innovation? There was a sense that Australia and the West needed to keep up?
Yeah, I think it's a factor, but also, this was also a period of massive industrialisation going on in Australia, thanks to, Jack McEwen, of course, behind that, manufacturing. There was, massive awareness of the importance of manufacturing and development and agriculture. Agriculture in Australia, the CSIRO was really set up to help develop innovation in agriculture. So a very big emphasis in Australia. Agriculture is a very scientifically driven area of the economy and still very much is. If you want to know where a lot of the research is, go to agriculture, that's where you'll see it. So I think all those factors were about Australia had to become part of, an industrial economy as well as an agricultural economy. And we're not going to do that unless we have a well-educated and trained workforce. It's the cornerstone of those things. So there was that attitude.
Yes, and for Menzies, Australia becoming an industrialised country and with a strong, industrial foundation, was Australia catching up to countries like the UK, which he obviously looked to as the sort of the pinnacle of a developed nation, and he was very focused on building that Australian industry, and didn't want Australia just to be a farm, the world's farm or the world's mine. He wanted Australia to be, the world's factory as well, although it's interesting to reflect. It's, of course, a hypothetical. What would Menzies make of Australian industry and manufacturing these days, or the state of it? Quite different. Our economy, of course, has changed dramatically. It's such a service-driven economy, and, of course, there's the mining and agriculture, but manufacturing as a proportion of our economic activity is much less. I wanted to pick up on the Cold War influence of the Menzies era, and of course one of the most famous royal commissions of the five that Menzies called during his second term as Prime Minister from 49 to 66. Probably the most famous one is the Petrov Royal Commission, the Royal Commission on Espionage, which came in 1954 until 1955. Tell me about the legacy of the Petrov inquiry. Why was it so controversial, and then what were its long-term effects, Scott?
Well, look, the Royal Commission was established, and Mr. Petrov had sought asylum in Australia. They stopped the plane leading of Mrs. Petrov and so on, and there was allegations that some members of the press gallery. There have been reports made about members of the press gallery from certain sources on the Mr. Evatt's staff, and there was concerns about there was espionage going on. Petrov was going to from the Soviet embassy was going to tell all about what was going on in Australia, and so on the eve of the 54 election, Menzies called a royal commission, appointed a royal commission which had 3 sitting judges from Supreme Courts from around Australia. And the opposition was informed about this before the motion was put, and the motion was carried unanimously by Parliament, by the way, to appoint the Royal Commission. It wasn't just a Menzies thing, and they even had special legislation passed to make it really clear that this was an act which all of Parliament supported. So all of Parliament supported the Royal Commission. But many people saw the Royal Commission, especially on the Labor side, as a conspiracy. That this was set up to attack the Labor Party. The fact that some Labor Party staff members were involved in some of the aspects of it. So within the Labor Party, the excuse for why they lost the 54 election, the excuse why they lost the 55 election was because of the Petrov Royal Commission. It was playing up on the Cold War communist worries and so on, which, by the way, were real worries. Let's get a bit real about that. So that's one of the real things. So when the Royal Commission came out in 1955, around October 55, there was a debate in Parliament, and the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Evatt, had just informed Parliament that he had written to or telegrammed the Soviet Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Molotov, to question whether there were any Russian spies in Australia. Okay, this caused an uproar. Now, if you want to read a great speech, if you want to read a really great speech, anyone who thinks Mr. Menzies was not involved in the cut and thrust of politics, then you read Menzies' reply to Evatt. And this was really the end of Evatt, in a sense, if you like. And he really highlighted how Evatt had completely got the Royal... Evatt appeared before the Royal Commission, by the way, and actually was told had to be dismissed from it at one stage. He appeared as a lawyer, which people advised him not to do. So the evidence has now been done. Robert Mann's famous book, work by John Nethercote and Gerard Henderson and everyone else, that there was no conspiracy. Menzies didn't use the Petrov Royal Commission during the 54 election campaign. Artie Fadden made a few comments, but he was told not to. And it really highlighted, a whole stack of problems about the way the ALP saw this issue. So it's been used as a sort of, excuse of why Labor kept losing in the 50s when they should have been in power, is the argument, of course. So that's what the Petrov Royal Commission has become such an important event. And there was a book written by Nick Whitlam, Whitlam's son, back in the early 70s, which tried to play up that whole issue again. And that's largely been disproved over and over. What Menzies did after the report came out, he then called an early election, I think in December 55. So if you want to blame him for anything, he merely took the opportunity to do the final knifing, if you like, of the opposition with Evatt as leader.
Yes, that 55 election where the Menzies government majority was substantially increased. But I mean, Evatt and Menzies had battled this issue for many years. Menzies had tried to ban the Communist Party through an act of Parliament and the Communist Party dissolution bill, and Evatt had despite the fact that his Labor Party had in the end supported the passage of the bill through Parliament, he then acted on behalf of one of the trade unions who had Communist affiliations, Communist Party affiliations. He acted on behalf of that trade union in challenging the validity of that legislation in the High Court. So giving that sense that he had some sympathy for the communist side, not at all saying he was a communist, he certainly was not, but he quite rightly thought that banning a political party was a liberal thing to do, but he gave that sense to the public by acting on behalf of a Communist Party affiliated union in the High Court challenge. And then in the subsequent year, there was, of course, the referendum on communism in Australia, where Menzies tried to change the constitution which would have enabled the federal government to ban the Communist Party. And Evatt campaigned no for the change to the constitution, again giving that sense that he was a defender of communism, fairly or unfairly. And then this final blow with the Petrov Royal Commission, and Menzies making the most of it after the outcome of the Royal Commission in his speech demolishing Evatt as the leader of the Labor Party, but also, of course, increasing his majority in December 1955. What an extraordinary period in Australian politics that must have been, Scott. I wanted to just ask you to reflect now on why you think the number of inquiries over the years has really increased dramatically since the Menzies era. I mean, looking at the figures you publish in your book, the Hawke-Keating era, I mean, that was a period of 12 years. There were 201 inquiries, so there were 13 royal commissions and 189 other inquiries during that period. The Howard government in power for over 11 years, 4 royal commissions, 84 other inquiries, a total of 88. I mean, it's in terms of how many there were during the Menzies era, just 35 during a period of over 16 years. That was an extraordinary increase. Why do you think that has been the case, especially when you consider that Menzies is the longest-serving Prime Minister? His government lasted the longest of any of his successors, and yet the number of inquiries, at least on a sort of per annum basis, has gone up dramatically. There must be a reason for that.
Well, it's because government is more involved in more areas of our lives. I mean, in my lifetime, governments are involved in areas that were unheard of in my lifetime. Our demography has changed. There's families have become more fragmented and so on, and government is expected to fulfil lots and lots of roles under a host of areas, and so they need to get advice on those things. Plus, governing has become harder. As a society has become more fragmented, it's harder to get agreement on things, on what to do. And therefore you put up an inquiry and you hope that the independence and expertise of the inquiry will help the government be able to get certain changes or reforms done. And some of those inquiries have been very important in doing that. So I think it's a combination of government's doing more, therefore it needs to get more guidance about what to do. Government needs to try and get agreement on things. It's harder to do because our society has become more divisive and fragmented, and so an inquiry can help, build mend fences and get agreement and get consensus and so on. And the point we were raising earlier, the public service has become around Australia more politicised. People are appointed on contracts. They're not permanent public servants. So when there's a change of government, there's a change of public service. And certainly in my experience in Canberra, I didn't find, in my 6 years working for federal cabinet ministers, I didn't find the public service political at all. There was never a leak from the education department in the 6 years I was involved in that department. I didn't always agree with their advice, but that's fine. I wanted to give them advice. So I think it's all those factors coming in has meant governments have, we better appoint an inquiry, and that will also allow people also expected to be consulted more and to be asked more for their viewpoints about things. And we've got a whole stack of lobby groups in Canberra, and there's whole streets of them in Canberra, where their job is to seek to influence government. And a public inquiry is a mechanism that allows them to make submissions, meet, have hearings, have discussions with an inquiry and get their input in. So the lobby groups or the interest groups love inquiries because it's another conduit into government. As well as knocking on ministers' doors or department doors, they can knock on the inquiry door. So it's all those factors, I think, are doing it. You might say society's become more complex. I don't quite buy that myself. I think dealing with World War II and post-World War II construction was pretty complex sort of tasks had to be involved. We've had 2.5 million people come to Australia after World War II from all sorts of different backgrounds. So there's been a lot of complexity before. But I also think that people, we know indicators suggest that governments are not as trusted as much as they were before. And the very fact that there's such a high turnover of prime ministers and premiers, at least in some states, indicates that, well, they themselves don't stick around very long. And so a public inquiry report is what we look to.
So they're not going away anytime soon is the conclusion to be drawn. And, of course, there's a whole industry around them.
That's right. Okay. I do question some of the ones being appointed recently where I think they are on complex social value issues, and governments have given it to a Royal Commission or inquiry to do, and expect them to come up with the answers. When actually so many things in policy need to be resolved by politics and compromise and agreement, and you just can't expect a Royal Commission to solve all those because they're open to immense debate and discussion. So look, the Aged Care Royal Commission, 40 or so of the recommendations, there were disagreement between the two commissioners. There was disagreement between the senior counsel assisting and one of the commissioners. So that didn't work that well. So we shouldn't try and get royal commissions or inquiries to solve political problems. In the end, the government's got to solve the political problems by arguing their case, coming up with the correct arguments, and convincing people that this is the best way we can do this at the moment.
Well, as John Howard said, politics is about the art of persuasion, and that is ultimately left to the politicians and the governments to persuade one way or the other the public that their policy approach is the better one. Scott Prasser, thank you so much for joining me today on Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. It has been absolutely fascinating to learn more about royal commissions and public inquiries in Australia, something that is such a feature of Australian life, or has been since 1902, but incredibly important and influential and deserves a lot more scrutiny and reflection. And I think your book will be a welcome addition to the Australian reflection on the importance and the influence of these bodies. So thank you very much, Scott.
My pleasure.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.